the Grand Canyon, ancient, immense, and unforgiving. 5 Boy Scouts and their leaders set out, eager for adventure, confident in their preparation, unaware that nature had its own plans. Their journey would become a harrowing test of survival, courage, and friendship. Early June, North Rim, remote, wild, and deceptively cool. The Scouts, led by experienced adults, began their ambitious 7-day trek, packs heavy with gear and hope. Mark, David, and Jordan, best friends, saw this as their ultimate test. As they descended, excitement masked the canyon's looming dangers. The descent was breathtaking until the sun's heat became relentless. Spirits faded as exhaustion and doubt crept in. Water supplies suddenly seemed inadequate. The canyon's beauty turned intimidating and anxiety replaced excitement. The real challenge had only just begun. The troop left the rim behind, descending into a world of stone and sun. Confidence ran high, but the canyon's deceptive ease hid its true cost. Gravity made the descent simple, but the return would demand everything. The canyon was ready to test their limits. Mark, David, and Jordan's friendship fueled the group's morale. Their optimism and teamwork made the early miles feel easy, but the canyon would soon push their bond, and their strength, to the breaking point. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, its character began to change. What had started as a warm, golden light transformed into a white-hot, oppressive force. There was no escape. The sparse vegetation offered little to no shade, and the canyon walls themselves seemed to absorb and radiate the heat, turning the trail into a convection oven. The official forecast had called for temperatures in the 90s, a challenging but manageable condition for which they had prepared. But they had unknowingly walked into the first day of a freak, unpredicted heat wave. The temperature was climbing relentlessly, pushing past 100, then 105, on its way to a blistering 108 degrees Fahrenheit. The initial joyful chatter among the scouts began to fade, replaced by the rhythmic sound of labored breathing and the crunch of boots on gravel. Every movement required a conscious effort. The air was so dry it seemed to suck the moisture from their lungs with every breath. Sweat poured from their bodies, soaking their shirts and stinging their eyes, a desperate attempt by their systems to cool down in the face of the overwhelming heat. The leaders called for more frequent breaks, urging the boys to sip their water, but the water itself was now unpleasantly warm, offering little relief from the pervasive, suffocating warmth that enveloped them. A subtle but significant shift occurred in their perception of the environment. The canyon, which had seemed so majestic and inviting just hours before, now felt hostile and menacing. The vast, open spaces that had inspired awe now offered no shelter, no respite from the sun's unblinking eye. The silence was no longer peaceful, it was heavy and oppressive. The group dynamic began to change as well. Each individual retreated into their own private world of discomfort, their focus narrowing to the simple, agonizing task of putting one foot in front of the other. The first seeds of genuine concern were being sown. By the end of that first day, as they stumbled into a spot to make camp, the physical and mental toll was evident on every face. They were far more exhausted than they had anticipated. The water they had consumed was far more than they had allocated for a single day, and a quick check of their remaining supplies sent a ripple of anxiety through the group. Their canteens were already alarmingly light. The realization dawned on them with chilling clarity. They had severely underestimated the canyon's power, and overestimated their own preparedness. The adventure had lost its romantic sheen, replaced by the grim reality of their increasingly precarious situation. As dusk settled over the canyon, it brought only a marginal drop in temperature. The rocks, having baked all day, continued to radiate heat long into the evening, making rest difficult. The group gathered to prepare their evening meal, the usual camp camaraderie strained by a palpable tension. The leaders tried to maintain a facade of control, but their worried glances at the water supplies did not go unnoticed by the scouts. A quiet discussion began about their options. Turning back was not a simple choice. The climb out would be just as arduous, if not more so, than continuing forward. Their best hope, it seemed, was to push on toward the Colorado River, where an infinite supply of water awaited them. The boys, particularly Mark, David, and Jordan, tried to recapture the lighthearted spirit of the morning, but their jokes felt forced, their laughter hollow. The physical reality of their situation was undeniable. Their muscles ached with a profound weariness, and a persistent nagging thirst had taken root, a thirst that their tepid water could no longer quench. They looked at each other, and for the first time, they saw not just friends, but fellow sufferers. The shared experience was no longer just one of adventure, but one of emerging hardship. The first whispers of doubt began to creep into their minds. Had they made a terrible mistake? That night, sleep was fitful and scarce. The immense silence of the canyon, once a source of wonder, now felt isolating. Every strange sound, the skittering of an unseen creature, the distant fall of a loose rock, was amplified in the darkness, feeding their growing unease. They lay in their tents, listening to the hot wind rustle the nylon, each boy alone with his thoughts. They replayed the day in their minds, questioning every decision. Should they have started earlier, rested more, carried more water? The confidence that had buoyed them just 12 hours earlier had evaporated in the oppressive heat. In the morning, the sun rose with alarming speed, its first rays promising another day of brutal temperatures. The group broke camp with a grim sense of purpose, the festive atmosphere of the previous morning completely gone. They were no longer adventurers on a grand quest, they were travelers in a perilous land, and their primary goal had shifted from enjoyment to endurance. The descent continued, but now it was shadowed by the heavy weight of a dawning reality. They were in trouble, deep inside one of the most unforgiving environments on the planet, and their journey had only just begun. The second day dawned not with the gentle promise of a new morning, but with the immediate, oppressive presence of a sun that seemed determined to bake the very life out of the canyon. The freak heatwave had not broken, it had intensified. The air was thick and stagnant, devoid of any cooling breeze, and the temperature climbed with alarming speed. The scouts, already depleted from the previous day's exertion, found themselves under assault from the moment they stepped out of their tents. The heat was a physical entity, a weight on their shoulders and a fire in their lungs. Their carefully laid plans, based on normal weather patterns, were now utterly useless, rendered obsolete by nature's cruel and unpredictable turn. The primary and most terrifying consequence of this intense heat was the rapid depletion of their water. What had seemed like a generous supply was now dwindling at a catastrophic rate. Every sip was a calculated decision, a trade-off between immediate relief and future survival. The leaders rationed the remaining water with grim faces, their instructions sharp and serious. The joy was gone, replaced by a primal focus on conservation. The boys' throats were perpetually dry, their lips began to crack, and the nagging headache of dehydration became a constant, unwelcome companion for every member of the group. The Colorado River, once a landmark on a map, had transformed into a singular obsession, a shimmering mirage of salvation that was still more than a day's hike away. There was no mercy to be found on the trail. The path offered no shade, no shelter from the relentless solar radiation. The sun beat down from above while the superheated rocks radiated warmth from below, sandwiching the hikers in an inescapable furnace. The landscape, which had seemed so beautiful and awe-inspiring, now appeared menacing and alien. The vibrant reds and oranges of the canyon walls seemed to mock them with their fiery intensity. The world had been reduced to a stark palette of sun-bleached rock, blinding light, and the deep, dark shadows that offered no coolness, only a brief respite from the glare. The group trudged onward, a small struggling line of humanity against a vast and indifferent wilderness. The psychological toll was as severe as the physical one. Hope began to curdle into a quiet desperation. The leaders, who were meant to be pillars of strength and confidence, could not hide the growing anxiety in their eyes. The scouts, in turn, felt the shift. The sense of security they had placed in their adult guides began to erode, replaced by a terrifying understanding that the adults were just as vulnerable as they were. The canyon was the great equalizer. It didn't care about age, experience, or preparation. It demanded only endurance, and their collective endurance was beginning to crumble under the anvil of the sun. As they pushed deeper into the canyon's interior, the terrain itself became an active adversary. The relatively clear path of the upper levels gave way to a more rugged and treacherous route. Their map directed them towards a feature known as the Rocky Chute, a formidable obstacle that stood between them and the flatter terrain leading to the river. It was a steep, mile-long scramble, not a trail in the conventional sense, but a chaotic jumble of loose boulders and sharp, unstable scree. Every single step required intense concentration, as a misplaced foot could send a cascade of rocks tumbling down onto the person below or result in a debilitating fall. The physical exertion required to navigate this chute was immense, and it came at a time when the hikers' energy reserves were already at a critical low. Each movement was a battle against gravity and exhaustion. They had to use their hands to pull themselves up and over large boulders, their skins scraping against the coarse, sun-baked rock. The heat radiating from the stones was so intense it felt like they were climbing over hot coals. The air was filled with the grating sound of shifting rock and the labored, ragged breathing of the struggling group. Progress was agonizingly slow, measured in feet rather than miles, and with every upward heave, their precious bodily fluids were wicked away as sweat. The canyon's native inhabitants added another layer of menace to their ordeal. This was a hostile environment, home to creatures well adapted to the brutal conditions. The scouts were hyper-aware of the potential dangers lurking under every rock and in every crevice. The dry rattle of a diamondback was a sound that could freeze the blood, a stark reminder that a venomous snakebite out here would be a death sentence. Scorpions, with their menacing tails, scuttled for cover as the hikers disturbed their territory. The wilderness was not an empty stage for their struggle. It was alive, and its residents were a constant, unnerving presence, underscoring their vulnerability and their status as intruders in a perilous domain. The combination of the punishing heat, the treacherous terrain, and the psychological stress of potential wildlife encounters created a perfect storm of hardship. The group was being worn down on all fronts, physically, mentally, and emotionally. The rocky chute was more than just a geological feature, it was a crucible designed to test the limits of their endurance. It stripped away the last remnants of their initial optimism, leaving only the raw, desperate will to survive. They were no longer scouts on an adventure. They were simply human beings fighting for their lives against an environment that seemed intent on breaking them. In the midst of the treacherous rocky chute, the group's precarious situation took a dramatic turn for the worse. Guy Davis, one of the scout leaders and an experienced outdoorsman, was carefully navigating a particularly unstable section of boulders when the ground shifted beneath him. With a sudden lurch, he lost his footing. Time seemed to slow as he twisted in the air, his arms flailing for purchase that wasn't there. He landed hard, his chest and side slamming against the unyielding edge of a large rock. A collective gasp went through the group as the sickening thud echoed in the stifling air. For a moment there was only silence, broken by Davis's sharp, pained intake of breath. The other leader and the older scouts rushed to his side, their faces etched with alarm. Davis was conscious, but he was struggling to breathe, each gasp a shallow, ragged effort. The impact had clearly been severe, likely resulting in broken ribs and internal bruising. He was in immense pain, but his immediate concern was for the boys, urging them to be careful as he tried to assess his own condition. The sight of their strong, capable leader, now incapacitated and vulnerable, sent a fresh wave of fear through the already terrified scouts. He was supposed to be their anchor, their guide, and seeing him fall so suddenly and so hard shattered their remaining sense of security. Despite the excruciating pain, Guy Davis refused to be a burden. He was a leader to his core, and his instinct was to push forward, to keep the group moving toward the life-saving water of the river. Supported by the other leader and one of the stronger boys, he staggered to his feet. Every step was an agony, every breath a sharp, stabbing pain in his side. Still he pressed on, driven by a desperate sense of responsibility for the young lives in his care. His resilience was both heroic and heartbreaking to witness. The group's pace, already slow, was now reduced to a painful crawl, dictated by the faltering steps of their injured leader. The fall was a turning point. It was a stark, physical manifestation of their dire circumstances. They were now not only battling the environment but also dealing with a serious medical emergency miles from any possible help, with their water supply nearing zero. The incident amplified the sense of hopelessness that was beginning to permeate the group. The canyon had struck a direct blow, taking down one of their strongest members. They were no longer just a group of tired and thirsty hikers. They were a compromised unit, wounded and limping toward a destination that seemed to recede with every painful step they took. With their leader injured and their water almost completely gone, the fragile discipline that had held the group together began to fracture. The simmering anxiety that had been bubbling just beneath the surface finally boiled over into outright panic. The boys, seeing their water bottles nearly empty and watching their leader struggle for every breath, could no longer contain their fear. The terrifying reality of their situation crashed down upon them with its full weight. If they didn't get to water soon, they were not going to survive. The unspoken thought was now being whispered aloud, a sentiment born of pure, primal fear. The leader's attempts to maintain calm and order grew less effective with each passing minute. Their own faces were masks of exhaustion and deep-seated worry, which did little to reassure the scouts. Cohesive group travel dissolved into a desperate individual struggle. Some boys pushed ahead recklessly, driven by a frantic need to escape the chute, while others lagged behind, their bodies and spirits on the verge of complete collapse. The carefully cultivated teamwork they had displayed just a day earlier had evaporated in the intense heat. Survival had become a personal, solitary battle, and the bonds of friendship and troop discipline were straining to the breaking point. It was at this moment of peak desperation, with the group teetering on the edge of chaos, that the most fateful decision of the trip was made. The group would have to split up. The logic, born of panic, seemed sound at the time. The strongest and fastest members could push ahead, reach the river, and potentially bring back water or summon help for the weaker members and the injured leader who were slowing the entire party down. It was a gamble, a desperate roll of the dice in a game where the stakes were life and death. The decision was not made lightly, but in the crucible of the canyon it felt like their only remaining option. By the end of the second day, dehydration was no longer a future threat, it was a crippling reality. Its effects were becoming dangerously apparent. Dizziness, confusion, and extreme fatigue plagued every member of the group. The decision to split was the final desperate act of a group that had been pushed far beyond its limits. The three best friends, Mark, David, and Jordan, were among those designated to go ahead. They were seen as the fastest and most motivated. As they prepared to leave the main party behind, they had no idea that this separation would lead them not to salvation but deeper into the heart of the tragedy. The decision to split the group was born from the depths of desperation, a final frantic gambit against a ticking clock. The air was thick with unspoken fears, and the heavy weight of what was at stake. Guy Davis, the injured leader, was too weak to move quickly, and several of the younger scouts were on the verge of total collapse. To stay together meant moving at the pace of the slowest member, a pace that felt like a death sentence in the relentless heat. The logic was brutal but simple. The faster, stronger members had a chance to make a dash for the river. They could be the salvation for the entire group, a spearhead to punch through the wall of heat and bring back life-giving water. This plan was not a product of calm deliberation, but of sheer, unadulterated panic. The leaders, their own judgment clouded by dehydration and exhaustion, agreed it was the only way. To remain unified, they reasoned, was to condemn everyone to a slow, agonizing demise. If we didn't leave, we were all going to die, Jordan would later recall, capturing the stark calculus that governed their choice. The three best friends, Mark, David, and Jordan, were chosen for this critical mission. They were young, they were still relatively strong, and their deep bond was seen as an asset that would keep them focused and mutually supportive on their desperate race against time. The separation was a somber, hurried affair. There were no long goodbyes, only grim instructions and the pooling of the last few drops of water into the canteens of the departing trio. The boys looked back at their friends and leaders, seeing the hollowed-out expressions and the faint glimmers of hope in their eyes. The weight of responsibility settled heavily on their young shoulders. They were no longer just trying to save themselves, they were carrying the hopes of the entire troop. It was a burden almost as heavy as the suffocating heat and the crushing thirst that was already tormenting them. With a final nod, the three friends turned their backs on the weakened party and set off. They moved with a renewed, if frantic, sense of purpose. The trail ahead, they believed, led directly to the Colorado River. They were a forlorn hope, a small advance party sent into the unforgiving wilderness on a mission that offered the slimmest chance of success. As they disappeared around a bend in the canyon, the remaining members of the troop were left behind in an eerie, profound silence, their fate now resting in the hands of three 15-year-old boys. The split was complete, a schism that would alter the course of all their lives forever. Mark, David, and Jordan pushed forward with a surge of adrenaline-fueled determination. The act of moving, of doing something, was a temporary antidote to the paralyzing fear that had gripped them. They were the A-team, the group's best hope, and they clung to this idea as a shield against the overwhelming despair. They moved faster than they had in hours, their youthful energy rekindled by the gravity of their mission. The thought of their friends and leaders waiting for them, depending on them, spurred them on. Every step was a declaration of defiance against the canyon that was trying to swallow them whole. They were on a sacred quest now, and failure was simply not an option they could allow themselves to consider. Their friendship became their primary survival tool. They fell into a familiar rhythm, matching each other's pace, offering clipped words of encouragement when one of them stumbled. The easy banter of the first day was gone, replaced by a terse, focused communication. They were a single entity with a single goal: water. The image of the Colorado River became a powerful mantra in their minds, a cool, blue oasis that promised an end to their suffering. They visualized dipping their heads into its current, of filling their bottles to the brim, of the sheer bliss of quenching the fire that raged in their throats. This vision was their fuel, driving them onward through the suffocating heat. But the canyon was not done with them. The physical toll of their journey was becoming catastrophic. Dehydration was no longer just a source of discomfort. It was beginning to dismantle their bodies and minds. Dizziness washed over them in waves, forcing them to pause and steady themselves against the hot rock walls. Their vision blurred at the edges, and the unrelenting sun created phantom shapes that shimmered in the heat ahead. Their muscles screamed in protest, cramping from the loss of electrolytes. They were running on fumes, their physical reserves draining away with every agonizing step. The hope that drove them forward was locked in a desperate battle with the physical decay that was pulling them back. Despite the mounting physical distress, they pressed on, their focus narrowed to the point of obsession. The world beyond the trail ceased to exist. There was only the path ahead, the heat, the thirst, and the mission. They were a forlorn hope, 3 young soldiers on a battlefield not of their choosing, fighting an enemy they could not see but could feel in every cell of their being. They were driven by loyalty, by friendship, and by the most basic instinct of all, the will to live. But in the deceptive maze of the Grand Canyon, determination alone is not always enough to find the right path. In their desperate haste, a critical error was made. The boys, their judgment severely impaired by advanced dehydration, came to a fork in the trail. One path seemed to lead down more steeply, a promising sign that it was heading toward the river. The other was less distinct, climbing slightly before leveling off. In their water-starved minds, down was the only logical direction. Without the clear-headed guidance of their leaders, and with their own cognitive functions breaking down, they made the fateful choice. They took the path that descended, convinced it was a shortcut that would deliver them to the river more quickly. It was a decision that would lead them not to salvation, but to a dead end. The new trail was treacherous, steeper and more rugged than anything they had yet encountered. It was less a path and more of a controlled fall, forcing them to scramble and slide down loose rock and gravel. This should have been a warning sign, an indication that they were on an unmaintained or unofficial route, but in their delirium, they interpreted the difficulty as progress. They were losing elevation rapidly, and that was all that mattered. They were so focused on the goal that they failed to properly read the terrain, to recognize the subtle clues that would have told a clear-thinking hiker they were going the wrong way. The canyon was luring them into a trap. The further they descended, the more enclosed they became. The towering walls of a narrow side canyon rose up around them, blocking out the sky and amplifying the claustrophobic heat. The faint hope that had propelled them began to falter, replaced by a dawning, sickening sense of dread. This didn't feel right. The terrain was becoming impossible, the way forward increasingly unclear. The realization hit them like a physical blow. They were lost. They had taken a wrong turn. The surge of adrenaline that had carried them this far evaporated, leaving them with a profound and terrifying emptiness. They were alone, off the trail, and trapped deep within the canyon's labyrinthine embrace. The weight of their mistake was crushing. They had not only failed to find the river, but they had also wasted precious time and what little energy they had left. They had let their friends down. They were now in a situation far more perilous than before. The side canyon offered no escape, only sheer, unclimbable walls. They had gambled everything on a desperate dash for water and had lost catastrophically. The silence in the narrow canyon was absolute, broken only by their own ragged, panicked breaths. They had walked willingly into a dead end, and the walls of the canyon seemed to be closing in around them. Their mistaken path terminated abruptly and horrifyingly. The boys rounded a final bend and stopped dead in their tracks, their hearts sinking into the pits of their stomachs. The trail simply vanished. Before them was a sheer, vertical drop of 200 feet. A massive, unscalable cliff face plunged down to the canyon floor below. There was no way forward. They crept to the edge, their legs trembling, and peered over. Far below, they could see the green ribbon of vegetation that marked a creek bed, a tributary that likely fed into the main river, but it might as well have been on another planet. It was impossibly, cruelly, out of reach. A wave of utter hopelessness washed over them, a despair so complete it was physically paralyzing. They were trapped. They didn't have the strength to climb back up the treacherous route they had just descended. Going forward was impossible. They were standing on a precipice, both literally and metaphorically, caught between an impassable drop and an insurmountable climb. The canyon had cornered them. The last embers of their hope were extinguished, replaced by the cold, hard certainty of their doom. They slumped to the ground, defeated, the hot rock searing through their clothes as they stared blankly into the abyss. It was here, at the edge of the world, that David's body finally gave out. He had been pushing himself beyond all human limits, driven by his unwavering spirit and his loyalty to his friends. But the human body can only endure so much. The severe dehydration, combined with the extreme exertion and heat, had pushed his system into a state of critical failure. He collapsed onto the dusty ground, his movements weak and uncoordinated. His friends rushed to his side, their own exhaustion forgotten in a surge of panic. David was delirious, his words jumbled and nonsensical. His skin, once pouring sweat, was now eerily dry and hot to the touch. Mark and Jordan watched in horror as their best friend began to shut down before their very eyes. The sweating had stopped, a terrifying sign that his body had lost its ability to regulate its temperature. This was heat stroke in its most advanced and deadly stage. They knew with a chilling certainty that if they didn't get him water immediately, he would die. The desperation that had been their constant companion now intensified into a frantic primal terror. Their friend, the vibrant heart of their trio, was slipping away from them on a desolate cliff edge, miles from help, with no way down and no way back. David's collapse was the final, devastating blow. Mark and Jordan were no longer just lost hikers, they were horrified witnesses to their best friend's body betraying him. His delirium worsened, his eyes unfocused as he mumbled incoherently. The boy they knew, the funny, vibrant, endlessly enthusiastic David, was gone, replaced by a feverish, fading shell. They tried to talk to him, to keep him conscious, their voices cracking with fear and helplessness. They had no water to give him, no shade to move him to. All they could do was watch as the life force seemed to drain out of him under the brutal Arizona sun. It was a uniquely cruel form of torture, being powerless to help someone they loved so dearly. The sight of their friend's rapid decline ignited a last desperate spark of action in Mark and Jordan. Staying on the ledge meant certain death for all three of them. The only chance, however slim, lay at the bottom of that 200-foot cliff. They looked at each other, a silent, terrified understanding passing between them. They had to go down. It was a suicidal notion. They had no ropes, no climbing gear, and no experience in rappelling or rock climbing. To attempt a free climb down a sheer cliff face was to invite disaster. But the alternative, to stay and watch David die, was unthinkable. They had to try. Their decision made, they began the perilous descent. It was not a climb, it was a controlled fall, a desperate scramble from one tiny handhold to the next. They moved with the frantic energy of cornered animals, their minds blocking out the terrifying height and the enormous risk. Every movement was a gamble. Loose rocks crumbled under their fingers and feet, sending showers of dust and pebbles into the void below. Their muscles, already screaming from dehydration and exhaustion, were pushed into an agonizing final effort. It was a miracle of sheer will and adrenaline that they didn't fall, a testament to the powerful instinct to survive and to save their friend. Somehow impossibly, they made it. They reached the bottom, their bodies scraped, bruised, and trembling with shock and exertion. They had conquered the cliff. They immediately scrambled towards the green vegetation they had seen from above, their hearts pounding with a fragile, renewed hope. They found the creek bed. It was there. They had reached the water. But as they plunged their faces into the cool stream, their relief was instantly overshadowed by a terrible, gut-wrenching realization. They had made it, but David was still at the top of the cliff, alone and dying. Their desperate climb had been for nothing if they couldn't get the water back to him in time. Having miraculously scrambled down the 200-foot cliff, Mark and Jordan found themselves standing in the narrow creek bed. Their relief was immediate and overwhelming, a primal response to the life-saving liquid they had fought so desperately to reach. They plunged their hands and faces into the cool, clear water, feeling the first real relief they'd had in what seemed like an eternity. The water was a shock to their overheated systems, a jolt of life that, for a moment, cleared the fog of dehydration from their minds. For just a fleeting second they allowed themselves to feel a flicker of triumph. They had done the impossible. They had beaten the cliff and found water. But this moment of personal salvation was instantly eclipsed by the horrifying reality of their situation. David was still at the top of that cliff, alone, unconscious, and dying. The water at their feet was useless unless they could get it to him. The renewed clarity of thought brought with it a crushing wave of urgency and, well, a new, more focused kind of despair. The climb down had been a one-way trip, a desperate adrenaline-fueled scramble that they knew they could not repeat in reverse. There was just no way to get a canteen of water back up that sheer rock face to their dying friend. Their miraculous descent had only served to trap them at the bottom, separating them from the one person who needed them most. A frantic, desperate plan began to form in their exhausted minds. They couldn't go back up, but maybe they could find another way. They reasoned that this creek must eventually lead to the main Colorado River. If they could follow it, they might find other hikers, park rangers, or a rafting party. Anyone who could help. It was an incredible long shot, a gamble built on a stack of other gambles. They would have to leave David, entrusting his fate to chance, while they raced against an invisible, rapidly dwindling clock. The choice was agonizing, but it was the only one they had left. Staying put would save no one. With their water bottles finally full, they took one last look up at the top of the cliff, offering a silent, desperate prayer for their friend. They couldn't see him from their position, and the silence from above was terrifying. Every instinct screamed at them not to leave him, but logic, however cruel, dictated their path. They had to go. They had to run. So, they turned and began to follow the creek bed downstream, their wet boots splashing through the shallow water. Their mission had changed once again. They were no longer just seeking water for themselves, they were racing to find a miracle for David. The journey down the creek bed was a torturous race against the clock. Every second that passed felt like a betrayal of their friend, still lying helpless at the top of the cliff. Mark and Jordan pushed their exhausted bodies to their absolute limits, stumbling over slick, moss-covered rocks and wading through knee-deep pools of water. The terrain was difficult, forcing them to move much slower than they wanted. The narrow canyon walls twisted and turned, each bend offering a sliver of hope only to reveal, well, just another confining stretch of rock. The silence was deafening, broken only by their own ragged breaths and the splashing of their feet. Time became a malevolent force, stretching and compressing in their distressed minds. A minute felt like an hour, and the thought of what was happening to David during that time was an unbearable weight. They pictured him alone, his condition worsening with every tick of the clock. The guilt was a physical pain, as sharp and real as the cuts on their hands and the ache in their muscles. They had been forced to abandon him to save him, a paradox that their minds struggled to process. This agony drove them forward, forcing them to ignore the pain in their bodies and focus solely on the desperate need for speed. They were running on pure, undiluted fear. The creek bed finally began to widen, and the confining walls of the side canyon started to fall away. They could see a larger opening ahead, and the sound of rushing water grew louder, a deep and powerful roar that was unmistakably the Colorado River. Hope, fragile and tentative, surged through them once more. They had made it. They had reached the main artery of the Grand Canyon. This was where people would be. This was where they could find help. They burst out of the side canyon onto the sandy banks of the mighty river, their eyes frantically scanning the water in both directions. The scale of the river was immense, a powerful, churning force of nature. For a moment they saw nothing. The river was empty, the banks were deserted. The vast, empty landscape seemed to mock their efforts. The flicker of hope died, plunging them back into the depths of despair. Had they come all this way for nothing? Were they truly, utterly alone in this vast wilderness? They screamed for help, their voices raw and cracking, the sound swallowed almost immediately by the roar of the river and the immense scale of the canyon. Their desperate cries echoed off the ancient walls and then faded, leaving them in a profound and devastating silence. It felt like the final crushing blow. Just as the last vestiges of hope were about to be swept away by the powerful current of the Colorado River, a miracle honestly appeared. Downstream, rounding a bend, came two bright yellow rafts. To the exhausted, delirious boys, the sight was so unbelievable it seemed like a hallucination. They waved their arms frantically, screaming with what little strength they had left. The figures on the rafts spotted them, and the boats immediately began to paddle towards the shore. As they drew closer, Mark and Jordan could see they were not just any river rafters. By an incredible stroke of fate, The rafts were filled with a group of off-duty doctors and paramedics on a private trip. Help had arrived in its most perfect and improbable form. The medical professionals swarmed onto the beach, their training kicking in instantly. They saw the condition of the two boys, their scraped bodies, their wild eyes, their obvious signs of severe dehydration and exhaustion, and immediately went to work. But Mark and Jordan could barely register their own needs. They gasped out their story, pointing back up towards the unseen cliff edge, their words tumbling out in a panicked, incoherent stream. "Our friend, David. He's up there. He's not breathing right." He collapsed. The urgency and terror in their voices conveyed the gravity of the situation more than words ever could. The rescue party understood immediately. While some of the group stayed to administer aid to Mark and Jordan, a team of the most experienced paramedics grabbed their advanced medical kits and started scrambling towards the side canyon. They knew that time was the most critical factor. They had no idea what they would find, but they moved with a practiced speed and efficiency that was honestly breathtaking to watch. For Mark and Jordan, watching these competent, equipped professionals run towards the cliff they had so recently descended was a moment of profound, overwhelming relief. They had done it. They had found help. David was going to be saved. They collapsed onto the sand, the last of their adrenaline reserves finally spent. They had passed the baton. Their desperate, impossible mission was over, and it was now in the hands of people who knew what they were doing. The weight of the past few hours, the fear, the guilt, the physical agony, all came crashing down on them. They were safe, and help was on the way for their friend. They clung to this thought, a mantra of hope against the encroaching darkness of complete physical and emotional collapse. The fleeting miracle had happened. Now they could only wait and pray that it was not too late. The paramedics who raced up the side canyon were skilled and determined, but the terrain was, well, just brutal. It took them precious, agonizing minutes to locate a viable path and begin the difficult ascent towards the ledge where David lay. Back on the riverbank, Mark and Jordan waited, the silence stretching into what felt like an unbearable eternity. The initial wave of relief had subsided, replaced by a gnawing, terrible anxiety. Every passing second felt like a hammer blow. They strained their ears for any sound from above, a shout, a call, anything to indicate that David had been found, that he was alive. But the canyon offered only the indifferent roar of the river. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, one of the paramedics reappeared at the mouth of the side canyon. His face was a grim, unreadable mask. He walked slowly towards the group on the beach, and the look in his eyes told the story before he ever spoke a word. The hope that had sustained Mark and Jordan for the past hour shattered into a million pieces. The paramedic knelt beside them and spoke softly, his words clinical yet full of a deep, human sorrow. They had reached David. They had done everything they could, but it was too late. David had stopped breathing moments before they arrived. He was gone. The news was a physical blow, a punch to the gut that stole the air from their lungs. It didn't seem real. It couldn't be real. They had made it. They had found help. It was supposed to work. A profound, uncomprehending silence fell over the two boys. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, the roar of the river fading into a distant hum. David, their friend, the heart of their group, the boy with the infectious smile and boundless enthusiasm, was dead. He had died alone on a cliff edge while they were at the bottom of the canyon, so close and yet worlds away. The weight of this reality was heavier than any backpack, hotter than any sun. By the next morning, the sky was filled with the thumping sound of helicopter rotors. Park Service rescue teams, alerted by the Raptor's satellite phone, arrived to evacuate the survivors. The rest of the scout troop, including the injured leader Guy Davis, were located and airlifted to safety. They were all alive, but none of them would ever be the same. As Mark and Jordan were hoisted into the helicopter, they looked down at the vast, majestic, and terrible canyon that had taken their friend. They had survived, but their victory was hollow, forever shadowed by the tragic loss. The grand adventure had ended in the ultimate nightmare, leaving behind a silence that would echo in their hearts for the rest of their lives. The Grand Canyon is, a place of profound duality. It is a spectacle of geological time, a masterpiece of natural art that inspires awe and a sense of wonder in all who gaze upon its immensity. Its layered walls tell a story billions of years in the making, a history of primordial seas, continental uplift, and the patient, relentless power of water. For countless visitors, it is a place of beauty, adventure, and spiritual renewal. Yet beneath this majestic facade lies a raw and unforgiving wilderness, an environment that operates on its own terms, indifferent to human ambition, courage, or desperation. It is a place where the line between a life-affirming adventure and a life-ending tragedy can be terrifyingly thin. For the surviving scouts and their leaders, the canyon would forever be imprinted on their souls, not as a place of beauty, but as the site of their greatest trial and most profound loss. The stunning vistas and sun-drenched cliffs were now colored by the memory of unbearable heat, crippling thirst, and the frantic, desperate struggle for life. The silence of the canyon, once peaceful, would now echo with the memory of their friends' absence. They returned from their ordeal as different people, stripped of their youthful innocence and burdened with a wisdom that no one would ever wish to acquire in such a brutal fashion. The physical scars would heal, but the psychological wounds would remain, a constant reminder of the 3 days they spent in that crucible of rock and sun. The story of their survival and David's tragic death became a somber legend, a cautionary tale whispered among the hiking and scouting communities. It serves as a stark testament to the fact that nature does not play by human rules. They had prepared, they had trained, and they were strong, but they were overwhelmed by a freak event, a sudden and extreme shift in conditions that rendered their preparations inadequate. Their experience highlights a difficult truth. In the wilderness, there is no guarantee of safety. Even with the best intentions and careful planning, the unpredictable power of the natural world can create circumstances beyond the limits of human endurance, turning a well-planned expedition into a desperate fight for survival. This harrowing event forced a reevaluation of safety protocols and a deeper respect for the canyon's inherent dangers. It underscored the critical importance of understanding the specific perils of desert hiking, such as the insidious and rapid onset of dehydration and heat stroke. The story is not just one of tragedy, but also one that imparts a vital, life-saving lesson. It is a reminder that to enter a place like the Grand Canyon is to enter a world where one is not in control, where humility and a profound respect for the environment are the most essential pieces of gear one can carry. The canyon remains a majestic wonder, but it also stands as a solemn monument to those who have underestimated its power. For Mark and Jordan, the burden of survival was a heavy and complex inheritance. They had lived, but they carried the immense weight of David's death with them out of the canyon. In the years that followed, they were haunted by the what-ifs and the agonizing replay of their final hours together. What if they had not taken the wrong turn? What if they had found a way to get water back up the cliff? What if help had arrived just a few minutes sooner? These questions, with no comforting answers, became a part of their story, a shadow that followed them long after they returned to the safety of their homes. Their survival was inextricably linked to the loss of their best friend, creating a painful and complicated emotional landscape they would have to navigate for the rest of their lives. 10 years after the tragedy, the bond between Mark and Jordan remained, forged not just in the easy camaraderie of youth, but in the shared trauma of their ordeal. Their friendship became a living memorial to David, a way to honor the friend they had lost. They continued to find solace in the outdoors, but their approach was forever changed. They moved through the wilderness with a new kind of awareness, a quiet reverence, and a deep-seated respect for its power. They spoke to youth groups and other scouts, sharing their story not for recognition, but to pass on the hard-won lessons of their experience, hoping to prevent others from facing a similar fate. Their survival had given them a purpose to be guardians of a painful but vital memory. The experience reshaped their understanding of courage and friendship. They had witnessed true bravery, not in the absence of fear, but in the actions taken despite it. They saw it in their leader, Guy Davis, pushing forward through agonizing pain, and in each other, as they made the terrifying descent down a sheer cliff. Their friendship had been tested in the most extreme way imaginable, and it had held. They had relied on each other, fought for each other, and ultimately had to grieve with each other. This shared experience created an unbreakable bond, a deep understanding that only they could truly comprehend, a silent acknowledgement of the friend who was no longer with them. The weight of their survival was not just a burden of guilt, it was also a responsibility to live a life worthy of the one that was lost. They carried David's memory forward, ensuring he was not forgotten. They honored him by living fully, by appreciating the simple gifts of water, of shade, of a cool breeze, things they had once taken for granted. The canyon had taken their friend and their innocence, but it had given them a profound and lasting appreciation for the fragility of life. Their survival was a testament to their resilience, but their ongoing tribute to David was the true measure of their character, a heavy but meaningful inheritance from their tragic adventure. The Grand Canyon, in this story, reveals itself as the ultimate unforgiving teacher. Its lessons are not delivered in classrooms or textbooks, but are etched into the landscape and, for those who falter, into their very lives. The primary lesson is one of humility. The scouts entered the canyon with confidence, armed with training and youthful vigor, but the environment quickly humbled them. It taught them that human strength and preparation have their limits when pitted against the overwhelming forces of nature. The canyon demands more than just physical fitness. It demands a deep and abiding respect for its power and unpredictability, a lesson the troop learned in the most brutal way possible. Furthermore, the experience serves as a powerful narrative on the nature of courage. Courage was not found in a grand, heroic gesture, but in the small, agonizing decisions made under extreme duress. It was in the leaders rationing the last drops of water, in Guy Davis walking with broken ribs to keep the group moving, and in Mark and Jordan's desperate climb down a cliff face with no ropes. It was in the will to put one foot in front of the other when every cell in the body screamed to stop. This story teaches that true courage is often a quiet, desperate, and persistent act of endurance in the face of overwhelming fear and hopelessness. The tragedy also underscores a fundamental truth. Sometimes even being prepared is not enough. The scouts had planned for the expected, but they were undone by the unexpected, a freak heatwave that changed all the rules. This serves as a chilling reminder that there is an element of chance in any wilderness adventure, an inherent risk that can never be fully mitigated. Nature is not malicious, but it is profoundly indifferent. It does not forgive unpreparedness, but it also offers no special protection for those who have done their best to prepare. Sometimes the dice simply do not roll in your favor, a difficult but essential lesson for any adventurer to accept. Ultimately, the Grand Canyon Boy Scout survival story endures as more than just a tale of tragedy. It is a profound exploration of friendship, loss, and the unbreakable human spirit. It reminds us of the fine line between adventure and nightmare, and of the respect that wild places command. The canyon taught these boys and all who hear their story about the preciousness of life and the strength of the bonds that tie us together. It is a somber, powerful, and unforgettable lesson from an ancient and unforgiving teacher, a story written in sweat and tears on the timeless walls of the Grand Canyon.